One of Heidegger's most important concepts is the concept of Dasein. This is a word which, similar to Hegel's Geist, has a lot of history behind it in terms of the way it has been understood by different thinkers and the way in which it's treated in things like translations and commentaries. And Dasein is a very important concept for understanding Heidegger. And if you've read Hegel, especially like the phenomenology of spirit, Dasein has some implications which feel very similar to the Hegelian project as a whole. Namely, there's this sort of reflexiveness of human being that Heidegger is basically trying to talk about. This is my second video in my Heidegger concepts video. I'm making my way through Being in Time and giving an expose of certain concepts that might prompt some thought in you, and also is kind of a good way to get short little snippets of what these concepts are. But Dasein is peculiar because it's not a subject like any other subject. You know, you can talk about Dasein is this and Dasein is that, but it's not necessarily a singular. Dasein can be a plural, but we can kind of get some hints from the texts as to what Dasein really is. This is from page 26 of the McCoy-Robinson translation. If the question about being is to be explicitly formulated and carried through in such a manner as to be completely transparent to itself, then any treatment of it in line with the elucidations we have given requires us to explain how being is to be looked at, how its meaning is to be understood and conceptually grasped. It requires us to prepare the way for choosing the right entity for our example, and to work out the genuine way of access to it. So he's trying to find a good way in to talk about being and what it is. If you watched my last Heidegger concepts video, you kind of get a little idea of why Heidegger has a problem with the previous conceptions of being. Looking at something, understanding and conceiving it, choosing, access to it, all these ways of behaving are constitutive for our inquiry, and therefore are modes of being for those particular entities which we, the inquirers, are ourselves. Thus, to work out the question of being adequately, we must make an entity, the inquirer, transparent in his own being. The very asking of this question is an entity's mode of being, and as such, it gets its essential character from what is inquired about, namely being. This entity, which each of us is himself, and which includes inquiring as one of the possibilities of its being, we shall denote by the term Dasein. So there's a hint of the idea that being is self-reflexive that Hegel talks about. He says the very asking of this question is an entity's mode of being, which seems to imply that Dasein has a very close relationship with the idea of being. And very much so when he goes on to say that part of the thing that makes Dasein what it is, and Dasein literally means being there or being here. Some of the meaning gets lost in translation, but there's a loose idea of temporality in the idea of Dasein. But it's basically an existing within a certain thing or at a certain thing, and it has this self-reflexivity to it in which it gets to know being and its own being by the fact that part of its being or part of its existence is the questioning of its own being. Again, he says this entity which each of us is himself, so each of us meaning all of human subjects, at least he would conceive of it as humans. There's some room kind of, especially with like the rise of AI, if like you can consider AI Dasein, but certainly not in Heidegger's text. This entity which each of us is himself, and which includes inquiring as one of the possibilities of its being, we shall denote by the term Dasein. So questioning about being is part of the being of Dasein. It's part of what gives it its special character. And he goes on to give us a more clear idea. He says, in the question of the meaning of being, there is no circular reasoning, but rather a remarkable relatedness backward or forward, which what we are asking about, being, bears to the inquiry itself as a mode of being of an entity. So again, Hegel stresses this a lot, that as we look out into the world and take a phenomenological understanding of the world, we realize the world's self-sameness towards ourselves. Basically, we figure out, just as we are in flux, so is everything else is in flux. And we start to become aware of the fact that everything is spirit, that everything is this one with a capital O, or this entity which is merely relating to itself. But there are some barriers by which this self-sameness is to be realized. Heidegger goes on to say, Dasein is an entity which does not just occur among other entities. Rather, it is ontically distinguished by the fact that in its very being, that being is an issue for it. So, one of the defining characteristics of human existence is the fact that our existence is an issue in which we have to inquire about. But in that case, this is a constitutive state of Dasein's being, and this implies that Dasein, in its being, has a relationship towards that being, a relationship which itself is one of being. So Heidegger is trying to say that in the very act of questioning our being, we have established a state of being, namely that the human condition, or what a human is defined by a very questioning of it. Just like when Heraclitus is talking about flux, and he's talking about rivers, and how we define a river by the fact that it's constantly changing and going through this flux. He's trying to say that, kind of in a very Heraclitean way, that humans, or Dasein, is the same way. And there's this perplexing situation by which we're asking about being, and it's in a sense on the tip of our tongues. And, and we get to talking about ontology, especially with non-philosophical people, it's as if it's right on the tongue, or as if it's already been said, as if it's so casually understood that there's no need to inquire into it. And in a sense, it is understood. We understand that being is a problem for us, but it's difficult to understand that fact that being is a problem for us also is constitutive of our being. He says Dasein is ontically distinctive in that it is ontological. And this is that same thing. We have an ontology of human existence through the fact that Dasein has this ontical relationship to the world, namely that it questions the world. And I'm pretty sure that's all I wanted to talk about for Dasein. Yeah. He says, here being ontological is not yet tantamount to developing an ontology. So if we should reserve the term ontology for that theoretical inquiry which is explicitly devoted to the meaning of entities, then what we have had in mind in speaking of Dasein's being ontological is to be designated as something pre-ontological. It does not signify simply being ontical, however, but rather being in such a way that one has an understanding of being. So, even though we're only in the introduction, Heidegger has spent a lot of time talking about how there's this problem of being, how people like Descartes have not understood being, and everyone simply talks about I am sat upon a chair, or the cat is on top of the couch, without inquiring into what the word am and is really entail, and how we can actually penetrate into that. But he also gives us a hopeful message that Dasein is to be designated as something in which being is in such a way that one has an understanding of being. So it's almost as if we're standing just a few inches apart from the way in which being actually is, and it's merely a simple project for us to break out of the very simple ways of understanding being and realize the function of Dasein. So hopefully you found this helpful, and hopefully you can utilize it in your own study.